Of course, your brain doesn't care about the gender of nouns. For beginners, it's normal to tend to ignore that. Who cares if it's there or die or das? But if you ignore the articles, the cases...
Hello and welcome to the German Learning Lab. My name is Michael and with me is my friend and co-host Alessio. And today we have a beautiful topic to discuss, which is the German genders, or as you know it, the articles or der, die, das. Alessio, how are you doing? Nice to have you here.
Hi, Michael. Nice to be here. Doing fine. Looking forward to have this discussion, this conversation with you.
Same. And we will, just to give you a little overview, we will talk about what they are, gender and articles. And most importantly, we will show you ways to deal with them very easily, because we've been doing this for many years and we both have similar but supplementing ideas on how to really make your life easier. So stay tuned. I will share our wisdom with you. Alessio, let's start with clarifying one thing. What is the difference between genders and articles?
Gender is the quality of a noun. No, noun are those words which refer to things. In German, easily recognizable because they have capital letters. So can be objects, can be animals, people, concepts. And those nouns in certain language can be gendered. So they can be masculine, feminine, or neuter. This is an old Indo-European tradition. Many languages in Europe have this feature, like Italian, French, Spanish. English doesn't do it. So in English, for example, a table and a lamp are both it, things. So only people have genders in English. So she or he. But if we look at, for example, German, we'll see that a table is a he. So is a masculine noun. And a lamp is a she. It's a feminine noun. And then there are things which are neuter, is a third gender, is a kind of a it, but can even be people like a baby or a girl. So these genders have nothing to do with sexuality, are just grammar categories. And it's about the nouns. So why the articles? It's because by the noun itself, you don't see the gender of the noun. You see the gender of a noun by the shape, by the form of the article, or the ending of an adjective referring to the noun. So for example, I said Tisch and Lampe, so table and lamp, and you couldn't say, well, one is masculine, the other is feminine. But if I put the article on front of it, so the table, the lamp, I'd say der Tisch und die Lampe. Und this der und die show the gender of the noun.
Why do I need this? Why is it important to know that the Tisch is der Tisch?
Well, you as a native speaker, research shows that you need it in order to better understand German. It helps you because of congruency, morphological congruency. So you can understand better how nouns are related to each other and to the verbs and so on. There are studies showing that if in German I remove the genders, then German speakers struggle a little bit more understanding and have some problems. But languages in general don't need it. Many languages function very well without genders. It's just a feature that can be there. And for native speakers, it's actually pretty easy to learn and it's useful. So it's important for foreigners to learn to use them correctly. But of course, in a language without genders, well, people still understand each other. It's not a problem.
As German is using genders and articles, you have to learn them. And let's maybe look into when is a good time to learn them, because very often teachers give the advice to learn the gender with the noun. So when you do your vocabulary work, you learn the noun, you should already learn the gender of that noun. What do you think about that?
Well, I appreciate the fact that they try to teach the existence of these categories from the very beginning. And the idea of learning der Tisch instead of Tisch, with the article showing the gender, die Lampe instead of just Lampe, it's not so bad per se. I mean, why not? If you can remember that and if it doesn't cost too much effort, you can try. There is a little problem with that, in my opinion, is that, for example, der Lampe is also something you can hear and use, because der is not only the nominative, so the subject version, we could say, of the masculine article, but it's also dative and genitive, so other two cases, I think most of our listeners know what I'm talking about, of the feminine article. So der Lampe could mean to the lamp or of the lamp. So if you try to just remember how it sounds, so to say der Tisch sounds well and die Lampe sounds well, but der Lampe sounds wrong, you will be into trouble when you get to the point where you actually have to use the form der Lampe in order to express genitive and dative. So there are some drawbacks there. It's not the best technique, in my opinion, and it's not sufficient. We'll go into that later, but I think mnemonics can be more helpful. But to start from the beginning, it's not a bad idea. What do you think about it? Should beginners start confronting the gender problem?
Absolutely. Do it right away. But I agree with what you pointed out. What is often not mentioned is how to actually do that. It's easy to say learn them. And what people then usually do is they repeat it 100 times until it sticks. But then again, that doesn't address your problem. I would say learn the gender, not the article. Just one more point to clarify the difference. We have 3 genders, but we have 6 articles. Der, das, die, dem, den, and des. So one gender can have different articles, like Alessio pointed out, right? So feminine could be die or der. Masculine could be der, den, dem, and des. So 4 articles for the masculine. So it's good advice to learn masculine, neutral, feminine instead of der, das, die, Lampe. So yeah. One more question, as you have learned German as a foreigner, right? So how do you know which article, which gender a noun has?
In German, you mean?
Maybe also in Italian. How do you know it in Italian? Same principle.
Well, in Italian is something you always knew, kind of, right? Because the thing with native speakers is that when they become aware of speaking a language, they already speak the language. So genders are already there. And it's obvious the stuff are feminine or masculine in Italian. Neuter was a new category for me. I didn't have neuter. So I had to learn that there is a third gender. And for English speakers, I think it's a new dimension of existence to find out, oh, there is that thing too, right? We have these new categories we have to fill. How do I know it in Italian? Well, there are some hints, some clues, like in German sometimes. So certain words have certain endings or certain categories. We will talk about it, maybe more about it later. And otherwise, it's just by use. You heard it that way. So you learn it as part of your world. The problem with learning German is that sometimes the categories aren't the same. For example, I still remember when I found out that in German, the sun is feminine and the moon is masculine. Because for Italians, it's the opposite. For us, the moon is a feminine being, a female being. There are poets talking to the moon as a lady. And the sun is Apollo. The god of the sun is a male character.
That's indeed an interesting difference in possibly all other languages.
Also from French and Spanish, I have the same problem. So because I speak French, Spanish, Italian, and German, so in every language, a noun can have one or the other gender or the third one, and you have just to remember them. So the question, how do you remember them? At first is an effort, is a theory, and then slowly it becomes part of this subconscious functioning of the language, and so it feels that way when you think in that language. So for example, the table is masculine in Italian too, but when I think in Spanish, it becomes feminine. So it came very spontaneous to me to say la mesa, and I would never say el mesa. It doesn't work. The part of my brain processing the language says no, la mesa is feminine, even if it's the same object, right?
But in Spanish, you have these endings, right? Anything ending in A is mostly feminine, right? In German, we have similar endings. So maybe we look into these endings quickly. The one thing I want to point out, if you learn a new noun, the only way to know what gender it has is by looking it up in the dictionary. There's no way you're going to know. As a native speaker, you learn this by listening to your environment for many, many, many years. I have a 5-year-old neighbor, and she uses the wrong article at times. It's also a lot of effort. We just don't perceive it as such, because we don't consciously learn the native language until we have to do it in school, unfortunately, or luckily, who knows.
I must say native speakers have some problems with genders when either they learn very technical words or when they have to gender words from other languages. For example, in Italian sometimes there are discussions about, in German is the same, when we use words like computer, directory, repository, mouse, server, all these words from English, which we use because of technology. Well, what are the genders of these nouns? And we have to decide, is das PC, die PC, der PC? So PC, I mean, computer, could be anything, right? We have to choose.
Yeah, in that case, it's in German, there's a standard. Usually it's das, but over time it adjusts or it adapts to the German equivalent of that. So, for example, Maus in German is feminine, so we say die Maus, and we also write it in German, right? Das Internet, because the net is in German das Netz. So the native language kind of puts their gender on the new words over time. But ask a German what the gender of Nutella is, and you start a civil war. Yeah.
In Italian is female, so it's feminine.
No, in German it's very clearly das Nutella. There's no discussion on my side. But there's people that say die Nutella because it ends in A, right? So there is some transfer happening here, like Monika, Maria.
We really have to talk about the endings then, right? Because there are certain nouns, it's easy to learn the gender of. I let you talk about it because you're an expert in these domains. You even made beautiful songs on the topic. Please tell us everything about endings.
It's easy to become an expert on that because it's knowledge you find in almost any textbook. What the textbooks rarely do is they don't tell you how to learn these endings properly. So they tell you that anything ending in heit, like Gesundheit, is feminine. And then Kite and or they tell you mountains are masculine. Der Kilimanjaro, der Mount Everest. Yeah. So all these things you can learn with a quick search, and please do so. What I have done is I saw a very nice mnemonic technique to remember nonsensical information, because it makes no sense to learn word endings like heit, kite, For example, the magic word you need to remember to learn all the most common endings for the masculine gender are der, igling, orismus, whereas is not always reliable, but that's fine. So anything ending in ig, ling, or, ismus, and er is masculine, with the exception of er, which is not 100% reliable. And then there's das and die, and there's 3 magic words. And I turned that into a song.
Der Igling Orismus, das Tumchen Momentumlein, nis die Heitungkeit Eischaft, die Joli tätig,
So once you have learned these, you're able to recognize, let's say, 20% of the German nouns. I mean, their gender. Yeah. So you see the word Zeitung, and you've learned is feminine. So very easily, you know the gender immediately without having to learn die Zeitung, the technique we talked about in the beginning. And that's why these magic words are highly efficient, beautiful, and 20% is not little. Yeah. Let's say you have to learn 4,000 nouns, 4,000, 20% of that is 800. You learn with the help of only 3 words that you can memorize in a day. You have a little enhanced version of this, right? I think you call this noun families. Can you quickly talk about this? Because I like this.
Oh, yes. It's just what I did when I learned German, because I didn't know about these tricks. I didn't learn the long word with all the endings in a row. So what I did is to learn the words with the endings, a couple of them, and then just remember that other words with the same ending would have the same gender. So it's like analogies. So for example, everything ending in Schaft is feminine, like Ungleichheit. So Gesellschaft, so society, it's feminine. And once I remember that Gesellschaft is feminine, I know that Freundschaft is feminine, and Bruderschaft, and everything else ending in Schaft will also be feminine, and so on. So for all other endings, I would do the same thing. But of course, I would nowadays recommend to do both. Actually, I would recommend to listen to your song because it's very catchy. And then maybe also use this technique because it's, I think, how native speaker brains work too, by analogy. So if you meet a new word ending with ear, for example, you assume as a native speaker that it's probably masculine. Not because you remember a mnemonic trick, but because all other words ending the same way will have that gender.
Yeah, you have 1,000 samples that follow that pattern, right? And of course, a few exceptions, but the exceptions prove the rule. Like Butter, Mutter, those are feminine, but in general, anything ending in ER is masculine. It's a good guess. Yeah. So this is one way to already take 20% of your workload off your shoulders very easily. One day of work, learn 3 magic words, and also pay attention to the patterns, as Alessio suggests. And then you are left with 80%. And how do we deal with the 80%, Alessio? The tisch. What do we do with the tisch? It doesn't have any ending that is recognizable.
Yes, the problem is all these other nouns, right? And we have to practice them, of course. Most teachers would say, well, you just have to practice them, repeat, right? But it's not efficient. It's really frustrating. And you keep making the same mistakes and you remember it one day. And then after a couple of weeks, you forget that because you have to remember the other one. And it's really frustrating, right?
And also, what do you repeat, right? So do you repeat der Tisch? Yeah, as we said before, it could be dem Tisch, den Tisch, des Tisches. So what do you repeat? So repetition is really the worst way to go. I agree.
Of course, with practice on the long term, it's true that you will absorb them and not think about them anymore. But there is this moment in between. So from just meeting the word to the point where that noun feels naturally as feminine, masculine, or neuter. And the question is, how do we bridge that gap? And here is where the field of mnemotechnics helps a lot. And well, we can introduce our 3 techniques. So I would let you start actually with the superhero technique. Then I can introduce the 3 tribes technique. And then I can talk a little bit about the game I developed to learn the genders. What do you think about it?
Yeah, let's do that. The superhero technique is not my invention. I basically reinvented the wheel. I made it better. So it's a very old mnemonic technique. And I read someone's PhD thesis about mnemonics in German training. And I just really made this more streamlined. So it's easier to memorize, easier to learn the technique and to apply it. The way this goes is that learning der, das, die, or learning that Tisch is masculine is such an abstract task. What you do is you replace the masculine, neuter, feminine idea with something very concrete. You can imagine, even in your mind, you could smell, you could see the colors, the form, and hear a voice. So you replace the masculinity with a superhero. You imagine a superhero. So instead of learning Tisch is masculine, you imagine there's a superhero flying on a flying table. He's sitting on a table. Maybe the table is turned on its back and he's holding tight to the legs of the table and he's just like flying through the air, like, yeah, having fun. And you see his tongue coming out like a child. So make it memorable, exaggerate, make it silly. And yeah, maybe you imagine he's naked. Why not? It makes it memorable. That's the thing. So I always give the example that when you ride the metro in Berlin, you don't remember me walking down the aisle of the corridor of that metro. But if there's a naked man going down, you will remember that man for years. It's all in your mind. You never have to share this fantasy with anyone. So make it memorable. And it's enough to imagine that. So you will never forget the gender of Tisch anymore, of table, after listening to this. You do the same with feminine. For feminine, I usually take a fairy, but you can also take a queen or anything. You can define those for yourself, but my advice is to stick to one per gender. So if you decide on fairy, stick to the fairy. I'll tell you why in a second. And for the neuter, I suggest just a chubby German baby. For example, you want to remember that beer is neuter and the baby represents neuter. So this image of chubby babies drinking beer like a German, that would stick with you. You will never forget the gender of beer again. Just to give you one image for feminine, I recently had an encounter with a fairy, and that fairy was sitting on a huge potato. Yeah, it really just enjoyed the smell of a potato, and it just played with her magic wand and carved some stuff into that potato. And all she could say was potato, potato, potato. So you remember now, Tisch, superhero, potato, fairy, and beer, baby. You will not forget that anytime soon. So you have to try this a little bit on your own. Yeah, play around with this. And this doesn't come naturally to many learners. You might need a couple of weeks to really feel comfortable with this idea of imagining things.
I like the superhero technique because it uses characters. A lot of techniques try to use this system of connecting something like one object, one place, one color to the genders, to the nouns. And I think your approach of using characters, so people, I mean, even fantastic people like a fairy or a superhero, it's great. It makes way more alive. And I also, like you already stressed, how important it is to exaggerate things, to make them absurd, fun, even something that feels evil or that feels wrong. All these very triggering feelings make it way easier to remember. If something is logical, if something is daily, if something is correct, it's very easy to forget it. So I use, as you know, I use a lot of mnemotechniques for my Chinese right now. And oh my God, my stories, I couldn't share them with anybody. They are just for me and my wife, and they're really not something I could publish. But that's why they work so well. And also agree on that things you said. Listeners, remember this. Fantasy, being able to create these stories in a way that works for you, it's a skill you have to train. When you use mnemotechniques, you have to train for some weeks before you get good at it. At the beginning, everybody struggle with that.
When I learned this technique, I was sitting in a classroom where a friend of mine was teaching this to students. My friend was using a different image for masculine, the lion. And he wanted the student to imagine a lion playing the piano because piano is masculine. And that student said, but lions don't play piano. I can't imagine that. That doesn't work. That is a level of mental stiffness that needs a little bit of training if you want to use this. But you had a really nice workaround when I told you the story the first time. What was that? It was really funny.
Yeah, I remember. Well, I just suggested that it could be a guy disguised with a lion costume, right?
There you go. So you can maybe play a trick on your imagination. It's not a lion, it's a guy in a lion's costume. Find a workaround if what we suggest doesn't work for you. Why does it matter to only have one representative per gender? It's easier to recall. So if in a month from now I ask you, what was the gender of potato? You only have to pick from 3 possibilities. Was it the superhero, the fairy, or the baby? If you have 5 possible representatives for the gender, then you would have 15 possibilities to choose from. And while that might work, it's a lot more work for your brain. I wouldn't suggest necessarily to go down that way. Although, Alessio suggests something that will little bit disagree with this, but which also works. Alessio, it's a good point to look into your 3 tribes technique, which is very similar.
Yeah, the 3 tribes technique works very similarly. So in microsystem, you have these 3 anchors, so these 3 characters, and you connect all the nouns to the same anchor. And this, as I said, has this advantage that you just have to choose among these 3 characters. My system starts the same way. So you have the first anchor. For example, for masculine, we could say we have der Mann, the man, which is masculine also as a noun, so it works. And then you have to learn the word chair, table, and apple. And these 3 words are masculine, so Tisch and Apfel and Stuhl, so they're masculine. And so we can start creating this picture of, a man sitting at a table on a chair and eating an apple. And so we're connecting these 4 words. And first thing, I would connect the 4 words together in a small picture, connecting these 4 words. Then what happens when I have a new word, like for example, Stift, which is a pen. It's also masculine. So instead of connecting the pen to the man, so the man has a pen, you can connect it to the other object. You can say, well, I can imagine, for example, of sitting at a table and I don't know where to put my pen, so I stick it in an apple. And then I have another noun, and it's a dog. And dog is also der Hund, so it's also masculine. So what do I connect it to? Well, I connect to the fact that I asked the dog to bring me an apple, and he brought me a pen. I can create a new story connecting the new elements instead of using the first element, so der Mann or the superhero or the one I've chosen at the beginning. There are a couple of advantages here and a couple of drawbacks. Basically, 3 advantages. The first one is that you have more connections. So that if you remember one of the other 3 objects you are connecting to the new one, it's enough to remember the gender. For example, if I ask myself what is the gender for dog, it's enough if I remember the pen or the apple or the fact that I'm at the table, and it's enough to remember the dog. So this is the first thing. The second is that when I use apple to remember dog, I'm not only practicing dog, I'm also practicing apple. So I reinforce the gender of both objects or all 4 objects I'm connecting. And the last advantage I see is that because I can choose any masculine noun I know, I have more possibility to choose objects that work better for a beautiful story. So, for example, I used only these few nouns, but if I had to choose, I could choose any masculine noun I know in German to connect to a new masculine word. And so I have a lot of opportunities for memorable stories. Otherwise, I always have to come back to the same man or the same superhero. The drawbacks, though, is that it's a little bit more complex. So I think to start with Michael's approach with the superhero technique is great, is the best way to start, is the easiest and most efficient at first. And later, I don't know, you can try with the 3 tribes technique and see if it works for you or if you feel better continuing with the superhero technique. Anyway, 2 things. We will add the links to our blog articles or videos describing these techniques. And please let us know which one you liked or how it felt for you, your experience with that.
You can also combine them, right? So initially I was teaching this technique with stories. So just get 10 nouns together that are masculine and associate them with a superhero. And the superhero is sticking the pen into the apple. It's a huge pen because it's a super pen. And then he eats the apple and then he throws it at the dog and the dog fetches it. All this stuff. Yeah. So all possible. I just, in the end, stuck with learning the gender of nouns one by one, just because initially it's easier to recall. Was it the superhero? Was it the queen? Or was it the baby? But you play around with this. It really depends a little bit on your own skill and preference. So you can combine them and play around with this. And in case you're worried, doesn't my brain get clogged if I do 1,000 of these? First of all, it takes a while until you have 1,000 of these images. Yeah, so don't worry, your brain will have forgotten the old ones. And by then, the information has sunk into your system. So at one point, you will not have to go back to the superhero. You will just know, you have a feeling, that was a superhero word, and you will immediately know it's masculine. So that's the beauty of these mnemonics, nonsensical information, like the gender makes no sense, at least on first glance. They make them tangible and feelable, and that's what I like. And stories add another layer, another level of intensity to the whole game. Strong recommendation to try that, absolutely. Lovely stuff. And play around with the tools. Speaking of tools, you have a game that actually might be interesting to the listeners.
Oh, yes. I hope it's interesting. It's the first game I developed for language learning. I created a small studio where I develop games for language learning. And the first game I developed is Der, die, das Rockets. So it's a game to do exactly what you said, right? To try to make more instinctive, faster, subconscious, the feeling about nouns, genders in German. Because it's true, mnemonics are just like taking notes. So it's a way to have these notes about the genders always close to you so that you can look into your notes and see, oh yeah, that was masculine. But when you speak, for example, you don't have the time to remember a story. And I've focused a lot of my research on this point. This is also how I developed the web apps in my grammar course, or Smarter German, in order to make the feeling for cases and prepositions instinctive, very fast, extremely fast, without thinking consciously. But I also wanted to make a game out of it, something playful, something fun. And so I create this small game with different difficulties, different kind of levels. And the idea is that there are the Germans that are under attack from Grammar Nazo, like a grammar Nazi. So Grammar Nazi is attacking the Germans and is attacking them with gendered missiles. So on these rockets, there are nouns. And the only way to protect the city of the Germans from these different kind of missiles with different powers and so on, like a video game, is to hit them, swiping them upwards, downwards, or horizontally. And of course, the difference between upwards, downwards, and horizontally is based on their gender. So you see this rocket coming at you with Tish on top of it, and you really fast have to decide in which direction you will hit it, because if you hit it incorrectly, something bad will happen, depending on the kind of missile.
But how do I know the gender? How do I learn the gender with the app?
To learn the gender before each level, there is a small training section where very slowly you can train the gender. Each level adds 6 words, At the end of the game, you will know 400 nouns. So each level adds 6 nouns. And at the beginning, you train them with wooden rockets that go very slowly, and you can get used to the fact that, oh, this I have to eat in one direction, that in the other one, and so on. And then there is the actual fight. So, and if you pass the fight, you can go on to the next level. There are different noun categories. So you can try the game. You will find it on the Play Store, on the App Store. Of course, I will add the links. And it just costs a symbolic buck, a symbolic dollar, symbolic euro, because my idea is just to share this game with all learners. And please, if you try the game, let me know what you think about it, because I always look forward to read commentaries.
Did you actually mention the name of the game, of the app?
Die das Rockets. So this is the name. And it's really important to me to know how much fun people have with it, because it's not just about learning. You can learn the genders in other ways, as we just said. But I was really looking for the most fun way of learning that very annoying part of German. And so, yeah, let me know if you have fun with the game, please.
No, I like the app. It's a cute little app, and I like that it's also limited to 400 words, which brings us to another question is like, should I really just learn random genders of random words, or what should I focus on when I start out learning German, for example? I have an idea on that, but what do you think?
I wasn't so obsessed at the beginning, I must say. I learned some of them and others I didn't. I just waited. At a certain point, it's important that you learn the genders of those words you use in certain contexts. For example, my first goal when I came to Germany was to start my master degree and then have an academic career. So for me, all the vocabulary connected to sociology and philosophy, it was extremely important I got it right. Because when I was talking in a seminar with other students or teachers, professors, I wanted to get my nouns right. But other words weren't so important. So I was allowing myself to make some mistakes. So I had a kind of flexible approach to it. So what is your approach?
Yeah, sure, you can learn the genders of thousands of nouns before you even learn the vocabulary, the translation of those nouns, yeah. And it's a nice thing to do if the alternative is playing Candy Crush on your mobile, who knows. But I would recommend to have a little notebook with you, and if you're already living in a German-speaking country, to always, after a conversation, take note of any genders that maybe were not clear to you, either in what you said or what others said. Take notes of your conversations. Learn from the things that you actually need. This is when you already need the language. If you're abroad, that's more difficult, but maybe you're taking conversation lessons. Yeah, you're joining Deutsch gym. Link will be somewhere here. Or you have a private tutor with whom you practice speaking. Take notes about the genders where you feel unsure, and then you apply these techniques. That would be my advice, because it is urgent, because you know this is stuff you need in your conversations, and it is relevant because that's stuff you need in your conversations. What does it help you to learn the gender of, let's say, blood? I'm just looking around to find something. Let's say you don't need that word. Why do you want to learn the gender now? Because if it takes, let's say, another month until you use that word, your memory will discard it or put it in the back of the archive, and it's much more difficult to get it back to the front. So I would always focus on what really matters. And that would be my advice to that. But you can also go ahead and just do it for fun. So learning 400 genders, absolutely fine. Yeah.
I agree with that. And two things. When you said before that you like the fact that there are just 400 words, I stopped the game there for a reason. So people asked, a lot of players asked, can you add more nouns? Can I add my own lists and so on? And I always said no, because the idea of the game is not to teach you all possible nouns. It's more to create those categories, to get that feeling, and not to try to drill all those words into your brain. So I selected 400 words that are very common. So it's very useful to know the gender. But the most important reason why you should train them is to get that feeling, a very quick feeling for gender of nouns. But that's it. I wouldn't recommend people to play the game to learn 3,000 nouns. The other nouns, you have to learn them, as you said, out of your actual context, out of the language you are using. So I totally agree with you. So that limit, 400 words, is not because I couldn't have created more levels. Would have been very easy. I could even create the possibility for users to add their own words. But I chose to stop there because I think it wouldn't be good for them. So yeah, it was a teacher's choice. And another thing I want to add, so the second thing, is that as a foreigner, as a learner to other learners, I want to tell you that at the beginning, your brain will obviously ignore articles and genders. Because at the beginning, it's not the most important thing. We also mentioned something similar, I think, in the last episode or the one before, when we said the most important thing in German grammar is the order of the words in the sentence. That's a priority, right? And then there are things like the words themselves, to know that Hund is a dog, to know that Apfel is an apple, and so on. So a beginner brain will spontaneously and correctly focus mostly on meaning of words, adjectives, nouns, verbs, and on the order of the words in a sentence. Details like the articles, the ending of the adjectives, and so on are not the top priority, are not the part of the language which carries the most information. And so for beginners, it's normal to tend to ignore that. But if you ignore the articles, the cases, and so on, of course your brain doesn't care about the gender of nouns. Who cares if it's there or the or does, if anyway you will not use accusative or dative and you will just focus on the fact that it's a dog. So at the beginning, to try to force your brain to remember genders could be a fight against your subconscious instincts that maybe you could spare yourself. So be soft, try a little bit. If your brain says, yeah, okay, I am curious about this gender thing, let's do it. Okay. If you notice your brain has a bad reaction like, oh no, please leave me alone, you can try later and it won't be too bad.
I want to say one thing. So it's a vast topic, right? Because it quickly transitions into cases, which is another arch enemy of the German learner. We will not touch that. But I teach this from the very first lesson onwards, simply because if you do this later, you will apply some kind of workaround. So let's say you will just say de, like the Dutch. Ich sehe der Tisch. Ich sehe die Lampe. Ich sehe das Glas. You get away with it because that's good enough for the Germans to understand. So I apply what I call the elephant technique. It goes back to the question, how do you eat an elephant? And the answer is very obvious, bit by bit. So you start really step by step. You approach this very slowly, one after the other, not trying everything all at once because that might really just overwhelm you and then you give up and you just guess. The problem with just guessing is that at one point you will know, oh, my German is a mess. Usually that means I don't know the articles. I don't know the adjective endings. And this concerns people. They know it's not correct and that kind of nags you. I haven't met anyone that was really at peace with this. Of course, it's like an itch. You can live with it, but you want to get this right at one point, at least to 80%. Yeah, I'm a big fan of the Pareto principle. Get 80% of your articles right. That takes only 20% of your effort. And that's why I teach it from day one. Make a continuous effort to improve. And after a couple of years, you'll be fine. It takes years, unfortunately. It takes Germans years, by the way. As I told you, the 5-year-old is speaking since she's 1. She still makes some mistakes. Yeah. And also often what students have to deal with is tables. I have 2 tables, I think, in my courses because they're helpful to get an overview over things, but they are not really helpful to help you speak proper German. It's really just for information. So tables are useful for information, getting an overview, but the way you have to study that and learn that is a completely different way. And that you don't find in textbooks. They throw everything all at once. It's too much information, and I can see the mess this causes basically every day.
I agree with you. The problem is which method the students are using. So I think we could agree on the fact that students learning with our methods, so mine and yours, can see the reason why they should invest in learning the genders from the beginning. So my advice here for the listeners would be, if they don't have the course already, to look at my grammar course on Smarter German, because the first and a half section, so the whole first section with all also the cases and so on, it's free. So anybody can watch it, learn it without paying a single dollar. And there, I do exactly what you said, right? From the beginning, because we decided also together, so Michael knows what we're talking. I introduce exactly the meaning of the articles. And so a student gets a feeling for why it's so important, what is happening when using the articles, when using the genders. And then, of course, they feel the urge to learn the gender of nouns. So I agree with you. The right approach from a pedagogical, from a learning point of view, is what you said. I was just referring to those students who, at the beginning, their brain really doesn't see the point of learning the genders. I understand them. It's not their fault. Yeah. I think we covered all the gender topic. Have we forgotten anything?
No, I think we are really at the end. And I hope this was really helpful, and let us know your experiences with the different tools and techniques and games. And let us know what other topics you would like us to talk about. Anything you want to add?
I'm looking forward to reading what the listeners would write in the comments or in emails. And thank you for this nice conversation, for this nice episode.
A pleasure as always. And thanks to all those that listened to us so far. Hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. See you in the next podcast. Until then, have a lovely time.
Bye. See you.